Well, I've been working on a few things. One of them I may not even share, considering how offensive it may be, but on that note, I just thought I'd share some recent observations. This morning I had a gentleman sharing his idea of what Dhyana or Jnana, right, being these levels, these stages towards, liberation, enlightenment. And I've talked about this before. Like we translate so many different words to meditation, meditative absorption, or calmness. And I mean, for example, shamatha. Right? Shamatha is pretty simple. It's very similar to samadhi, but I see it's not. I don't know if proper understanding of possible where the root is, because there's two different samas, right? Three different samas in this case. There's sama S-A-M-M-A, sama for correct and right. There's sama S-A-M-A, which is evenness. Let me just double check this. There's samadhi. So there's sama, even, equal, level, similar. Masculine would be calmness and tranquility, right? So commonly samadhi is translated as sama or sam for sama, correct. The A for chitta or anatta for mind. And D for knowledge, wisdom, concentration, right? I don't know if that's correct, because if you go and look at samadhi, with or without the line, they say it's commonly, or also used samapati. We've studied pati with a double T before, pati being to practice. So sama, in this case, is referring to, right, focus, absorption. What are we being absorbed in, right? Absorbed in our dhyana, our focus, contemplation practice. You can start to see why it's so confusing for a Westerner, because these are all very similar words. When you step away from the roots, right? I mean, it's funny. So here we are with sama, one M, but with a little bar above the A, the second A. Actually, feminine means a year. So, of course, we can consider one of the best Pali dictionaries to be failing here. But based on that, we kind of break some of our other definitions, because in the same book, he says samapati means exactly what they're saying, but it's without the line above the A. Right? Attainment, enjoying a stage of meditation, right? But you just said samadhi with the line above means meditation, one-pointedness of mind, right? Right? And a samadhi bhavana is someone who is cultivating concentration, right? So I argue that's where the confusion comes in. Not just in the West, where we translate everything as meditation when it should be more specific, and again, not get lost in the words and miss the meaning in the message, right? So in this case, we know what samadhi means. It's concentration. Whether you're meaning a certain stage of meditation or just the idea of focusing the mind or training the mind, like dhyana, right? Not the same words, no, but the meaning and the message are identical, right? If it's Ashtanga Yoga or any of the Buddhist sects, we have the 8 elements of the Noble Eightfold Path, which are sama with a double M and no little line above the second A. This means correct, right, what we should be doing. The idea of shamatha is correct calmness, right? So is sama the calmness and not the practice? It doesn't matter, right? This is why we commonly use these words in the West, because it saves us a lot of time explaining this, right? We'll say samadhi because we want you to think of focusing the mind, training the mind for this to be a practice, to be a lifestyle, right? And then they mention here that Theravada teachers rely, and it refers to the development of a luminous mind. It's not just Theravadins. The Tibetans will talk about that clear light of insight. Right? The Chinese will commonly use the metaphor, as would the Indians, but I'm just giving examples, use the metaphor of light for knowledge and darkness for ignorance. And it goes on and it says, development of the luminous mind, which is equanimous. Upekkha. Equanimity. Right? That's everything is, one and we're all equal. Right? And mindful. That's sati. We learned this one as well. So you see how incredibly confusing this begins? Luminous mind is a Buddhist term which appears in the suttas. Why? Mind of clear light, a bright shining mind. Remember how I said this? It's the same as dependent origination. It's interdependent origination. It's, oh my. Why do we get confused by the words and miss the message so often, right? Is that our ego allowing us to be derailed? When once again, the Buddha said this is a simple thing, but even he needed to be convinced to share it. He needed encouragement to believe that we were able to understand. And as I've said before, this is in a time that arguably, didn't fit the definition of the Dharma ending period as today would. So what I mean by that is way, 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 way more likely that the average person today is going to be incapable of understanding, let alone understanding, implementing, and practicing these teachings. Right? So in a time of a much simpler, everything was simpler, and someone with complete understanding to our entire lot on this planet, as it were, still didn't think we were capable of understanding this. What I mean is, obviously, it would be no better today, arguably much, much worse, right? So, that's all I wanted to share a little bit. I find it kind of funny here when we look at, right, we complain, it's not uncommon they complain that we carry these words over, because even in the Chinese, they use transliterations, meaning something that sounds similar, like Senmei and Senmodi, right? Like Bodhidharma was Putidamo, right? And yet there's other examples where you'll have, Indians being known through history by another name, right? But in Buddhism it says Samadhi, right? Here you go again. It says its root is Sam, A, and Da, which means to collect or bring together, and thus often translated as concentration or unification of mind. Right? And in early text it was associated with the term samatha, calm abiding. In the commentarial tradition, samadhi is defined as ekagata, one-pointedness of mind, or chittas ekagata. Buddhaghosa defines samadhi as the centering of consciousness and consciousness concomitants evenly and rightly on a single subject, the state of virtue of which consciousness and its concomitants remain evenly and rightly on a single object, undistracted and unscattered. Oof. Right? And you go on, momentary concentration. Well, they say kanika samadhi, mental stabilization which arises during vipassana. Right? Vipassana being a Pali word, vipassana, vipash, and yana. We've already talked about the root of yana, practice or a path. They call it special seeing. Right? Seeing pasana. Right? And then goes on and talks about access, concentration, upakara samadhi. And finally, absorption, apanya. Samadhi. Total immersion. Right? Seems confusing because he keeps saying concentration or meditation or absorption. But if you go back and you look at all of them, except for the beginning where it says the roots sam and a and da, means to collect or bring together. Okay, that makes sense. Concentration. But if you go and look at Buddhaghosa, another one of these interesting gentlemen, traveled long ways to share the Dharma, he says that it's the centering of consciousness, and consciousness is concomitants. That means all of the little aggregates and all the different pieces, right, our eye consciousness, our ear consciousness, and the storehouse of all our latent impressions, right? Evenly and rightly on a single object. Again, we're talking about this concentration again, right? Focus, right? It says it's a state of virtue in its consciousness and its concomitants, its pieces, it's all of its little aggregates. They remain even and rightly on a single object, when undistracted and unscattered. Focus, awareness. But again, he says evenly. So that, once again, brings us back to the real root of sama. One M, no little line over the A, which means evenness. Right? And not da, but di. Samadhi. Again, it's a little confusing. They are kind of the same root because da or di just depends on it's male or female. If you change the sex in this, that's where you get this evenness. And he mentions it twice, Buddhaghosa. Right? And even in the previous, even though they say it's to bring together, therefore we say concentration or unification of mind, talked about how shamatha is this collection. Right? They say that it's associated with shamatha, calm, abiding. We just talked about what shamatha means. It's just calm, and yes, resting, using that, or focusing. Abiding or focus. Again, the word you choose can change the meaning. And it says in the commentarial tradition, it's defined as ekagata, one-pointedness of mind. Right? So it's not a... That's where that confusion, the collection, because again, depending on the tradition, if you're talking about these different minds, you can be confused. The idea here, it goes on and says Samadhi and Dhyana, Samadhi being the last of the 8 elements in the Eightfold Path, often interpreted as referring to Dhyana, D-H-Y-A-N-A. Right? Again, D and Jnana, the practice of that focus. Samadhi and Dhyana are not the same. It says where Samadhi is one-pointed concentration. Dhyana, in Dhyana, the Samadhi is used in the initial stages to give way to a state of equanimity and mindfulness. The practice of Dhyana makes it possible to keep access to the senses in a mindful way, avoiding primary responses to the sense impressions. Again, I don't know who writes this stuff, but I don't think they really understand any of this, right? Yes, it can mean that, depending to the tradition, but at the same time, they just don't get it. Because if the person that wrote this section here under Samadhi were to read the section that's linked to, right there in their section, Dhyana, they would see that it actually means training of the mind. Commonly translated as meditation, but that's a veiled shade, a bit of veiled shade being thrown, right? To withdraw the mind from automatic responses to sense impressions. That's that idea of the collection, but it's not. You're not collecting anything. So that's where they don't understand. What are you collecting? None of that stuff exists. Right? And again, they miss the whole idea because they go on and talk about the first jhana is associated with meh, and the second, meh, and the third, meh. It's all a simple practice, and arguably, the deeper you get into it, sometimes it just makes it even more confusing. It goes on to say the practice of dhyana makes it possible to keep, right? What are you talking about? The training of the mind makes it possible to keep access to the senses in a mind. What? That makes no sense at all. You just finished saying it's a collection of these aggregates, yet now you're saying Dhyana makes it possible to access these in a mindful way, avoiding primary responses to the sense. No, that's not what you were saying. You were saying dhyana allows you to focus, and arguably the point is to go beyond those sense impressions and beyond the senses themselves. Yes, we're harnessing the self, and part of that is these aggregates, which include the senses. But in what way am I going to smell enlightenment? Or I'm going to see enlightenment? I don't care if I collect all of these aggregates. I'm not going to smell, hear, touch, feel, and taste enlightenment. At no point am I going to concentrate these aggregates into something that's going to allow me to see beyond the aggregates. No. They're missing the point. The concentration is actually the focus on these aggregates to see their emptiness and see beyond, allowing yourself to either tie up the mind, confuse the mind, or see beyond what we see as this collection of aggregates and confuse as the mind, right? But once again, the ego loves to get in the way. Here somebody thought they had an understanding, right? And they just go nuts and start typing this stuff. But, I mean, who are they? Who are they to think that they have an understanding of this? The notes just refer to two people who wrote about it 10 years apart, right? A good generation and a half ago was the most recent reference to this idea of what it is, right? And yet, really, it still is the biggest problem. It's the meaning and the message is lost in the ego, in the aggregates of language and definitions and meaning, right? Never simply. I mean, I understand completely. I understand completely why I am, but neither here nor there. Samadhi. Why don't you take a look in the dictionary?